few thoughts for me around the sermon title, Holding It Together. Holding It Together. It's difficult to speak after a week like we've experienced in the U.S. And I'm acutely aware and mindful of, if I look through the congregation today, of the various perspectives represented here. I experience a lot of emotions in my observation and experience of remote involvement mainly through channel TV or cable TV of what's happening on our southern borders. And I don't think anybody can just walk away from that and just say, oh, that's okay. You know, like it's something that happens every day. I was experiencing mostly sadness about the condition that we are observing and experiencing there. Sometimes I experienced anger. And perhaps I'm more involved in that because I'm also an immigrant. And I can still, even though it lies 20 years this year in the past, vividly remember the powerlessness you experience when you face an ICE official. I'm a grown man, and I saw quite a good number of years of active service in the Angolan War, so I don't think I scare that easily. But when your whole future depends on somebody that doesn't look friendly, because I think they pick people that who's not known to be, or doesn't have a natural tendency to be jovial. And your whole future depends on that person, and that person, if they don't like anything about you, no matter the 2 years that you went through every security clearance that you can think of, and everything checked out, if they decide they don't like you when we came in, they can put you on the next flight back to where you came from, and then for 10 years you cannot apply for a visa to come to the U.S. There are some, I think, here who also experience that, immigrants. I see Irina nods her head. I remember one time when, and forgive me for sharing personal stories, but I remember one time when our green cards got stolen in Italy, MJ and my card, pickpocketed in Florence. I had to conduct a wedding in Tuscany for the daughter of one of the vice presidents of IBM. Fortunately, they were in the service in Usmana Beach and they liked the sermon, so they asked me to do the wedding. And I thought it was going to be in Vermont, and then they said, no, I have to come to Italy, and I objected to that. But we were fortunate we went there, and when we returned without the green card, it was horrific. We had to travel from Italy to Geneva without money because they took the whole wallet, so we had to beg and borrow. We avoided stealing something because that would have aggravated the problem. But spend a day at the embassy in Bern in Switzerland and got some papers that they put in an envelope, and you never know when you deal with ICE what's in the envelope. So we came to Detroit. That was our point of entry, and the procedure was, as I've experienced over and over with ICE, when you walk in there, they tell you, shut up and sit down. And then I said, I wanted to ask a question, and then they repeated, sit down. And after the fourth time, I said, okay, before I get arrested, again, let me sit down. And I remember that day we waited patiently for, there were about 20 other people in the line before us, and I arrived at the counter and I said to the guy, this is my story. Why didn't you tell me that? in the beginning. He said, "You're in the wrong place." I said, so I'm not denigrating every ICE official here. I'm just trying to say that perhaps us that went through some of that experience without even a smidgen of the hopelessness that some of those desperate people experience, perhaps we look different at it. And no matter what the cause of it is, no matter who we think should be blamed for it, who should bear the responsibility, I think as compassionate people we should look at the situation with compassion and try to stay true to what the ideals of America are. And I know it's a complex situation. I'm not speaking as somebody that's looking for simple solutions and slogans. But let us be mindful that people are involved, and let us not objectify people involved in similar situations. It's also, I think, good for us to note that what we are experiencing is a smidgen of what's happening all over the world. This is a worldwide phenomenon. And there's a staggering number of displaced people. We are experiencing, I think, some of the result of difficult situations everywhere in the world. And increasingly, climate change is playing a role in this. It's at the heart of the African migration to Europe, where Lake Chad is drying up. It's almost disappearing. One of the biggest bodies of fresh water in the world it used to be, it's disappearing. And the whole Sahel region just below the Sahara Desert is becoming too dry to sustain the populations it always has, so those people have to go somewhere. If you look at India, 80% of the Indian population does not have access to clean drinking water. 80% of their fresh water supply is polluted. And India, with China, the two biggest populations in the world, are all dependent on rivers that are fed through the glaciers that are disappearing, that are melting. And you can imagine when billions of people no longer have a sustainable and a sustained supply of fresh water, what will happen. And I'm not being a prophet of doom here, I'm just saying we better strap in and realize what we are seeing on our southern border is the tip of the iceberg that lies ahead for us. And perhaps we should also realize that old approaches will no longer work, because we will just be overwhelmed by what is coming our way, and also the way of places in the world where there is perceived to still be sufficient means to sustain people on a basic level. I just cannot live in a bubble and keep quiet. I feel it is, I'll violate my conscience if I don't say something about it. And I say so not in anger, because what is discomforting to me and unsettling, as you know, is the seemingly increasing division and divisiveness that we are experiencing. And what is perhaps even more troubling is the drivers of that divisiveness. I want to call it the terrible trinity. The terrible trinity of fear. of anger, of hatred. Those three by itself, individually and also in combination, are causing us and the world very, very significant and lasting problems. And I want to remind us, the last time we responded out of pure fear after 9/11, that brought us that wonderful war in Afghanistan that we haven't finished yet, that cost us billions and that left us with a bill that our children and grandchildren will have to pay. And while we were going out of fear into Afghanistan, just for good measure, out of fear and greed this time added to it, we took on Iraq. And we know what the result of that was. When the whole region was destabilized again, and when that war was about to happen, I was in New Smyrna Beach, very much in the same position as now, except that we just entered the country. And in a congregation that had about 50-50 people on both sides of the war, I didn't speak up as directly as I should have, because I was concerned about job security with a young family that we just entered. You know, you don't have a safety net of family or friends or anything. So I want to get it on the record now to say, let us pause and think where we're going with this terrible trinity of fear, of hatred, of anger. The three in combination is mostly reserved for people outside the US, but we also look at each other these days with anger. I don't think so much with fear. And article after article I read in newspapers and I listen to interviews where people on both sides of the divide say, you cannot even be in the same room. It's impossible to have a conversation. And if we look at the situation that we find ourselves in, this chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, written by the Apostle Paul, or included by the Apostle Paul, an old hymn that was well known and used in the early church. This hymn almost sounds quaint, almost laughable. When it speaks about love and the importance of love. Paul wrote this letter probably in the year 52, 53, 2-3 years after he started the church in Corinth, which he did in the year 50. He wrote it from the city of Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And it seems that in the congregation of the church of Corinth, there were divisions and strong differences about many things. The first was about cultural issues. To what extent should the church or the Christians or the followers of Jesus conform to cultural norms around them in the city of Corinth that they found? To what extent should they say, for the sake of our future well-being and to get along with the people, to what extent should we conform to the practices that we find around us? And Paul enters into a debate with them about that in this letter. There was also differences among the people in the congregation between the wealthy ones and the ones that were poor, where the communal meals were a means through which those that did not have enough to eat could have a healthy meal or sufficient food to eat. And then, at some stage, it seems that the people who had the good food didn't want to share it with the poor ones. So they started eating so that they finished their meals before the poor guys could come in and take their food from them, the nice food that they've prepared at home. And Paul gets into them and says, no, that's not how we do things. We're all equal, we should share, and we should provide for those that cannot provide for themselves. There were also divisions about Christian teaching and practices. And in what Paul says, you can see that one group said, no, we like Apollos. He was another teacher that was there after Paul left. Another said, no, we like Paul. He's the better minister. And they were quarreling about this, who was the best guy to follow. And what was Paul's response in all this? He reminds them of what it is about in this community, as it should be in every church. He said, I remind you of Christ and the crucified one. That is in which you should find your unity. That is above everything else. And it's not about being rich or poor. It's not about the practices of the so-called heathen or the people that you find around you. It is not about Paul or Apollos. It is about Jesus, the crucified one. And he sketches the crucified one specifically as the crucified one that were crucified because he went against the power and the might of the empire and opposed that for a just and a compassionate way of being in the world. I think it is worthwhile for us to look at what he says, the love of Christ and God's love. And you're all familiar probably with the word agape. That is the Greek word used here describing God's love. A love that is selfless, and a love that projects yourself beyond yourself. Love that projects you beyond yourself. That is not self-centered and self-focused. And if we listen to that description, I think it is in verse 4, of what love is. That selfless love that he says that we find in Christ. It is not irritable, etc., etc. It loves the truth. It is not arrogant. It is not deceitful. And it celebrates what is good. Perhaps we should read that more these days. Just to remind ourselves, we that are followers of Jesus, this is in short the summary. That is a guiding light and a principle for us. The selfless love that we find in Christ, the crucified one. Something that we can hold on to. Something that can transcend all the divisions and the abyss that we are creating with this toxic divisiveness that is creeping into our very fabric, in the very fabric of our society, that is poisoning us, and I think changing our character, and letting things happen and let people do things that they would not do if it wasn't for this dangerous practice that we have accepted as normal. It is not normal. for us to be that way. The antidote for the terrible trinity of fear, of anger, of hatred is this combination of truth and of love, and the love that seeks truth. But in a world where we no longer know what is true, how do we find that solid ground that you can say this is what is true? How do we agree on what is true? I cannot give you a simple answer. I want to appeal to you that we continue to seek the truth, to never give up on that, to seek the truth in love, with that willingness to go beyond ourselves and the willingness to listen respectfully to one another and to seek together that common ground. Something that I think will be indispensable here is a love for science as well. And I think it is terribly dangerous when we raise suspicion increasingly about science as well. That is something that we can hold on to and say, this is, given the probability concept that is employed in science, with the certainty intervals and so forth, you can say this is probably true. We live in a very specific time, a time that is sometimes scary, sometimes driving us to despair, sometimes a time that is experienced as very good for other segments in society. And in this, what could easily be chaos, I want to appeal to you, as followers of the man of Nazareth, Christ the crucified one. Let us find our common ground in that love. Let us continue to be the people that bring hope, so that we together can lead the way and create lasting things of beauty, lasting things that bring hope, so that our being in the world and our influence on one another here in this circle and in society is not a destructive one, but our being in the world through the Spirit of Christ is one that indeed is based again on that trust which is at the essence of faith. Trusting that the Spirit of Christ will lead us to a place where we once again take our hands and say, enough of this ugly warring, enough of the terrible trinity of fear, of anger, of hatred. Let us embrace one another and build those bridges and repair those bridges where they have been destroyed, so that together we can reach that place in God's love that Paul writes about, where we no longer see the poor reflection of God's kingdom, but where we experience ourselves as being part of that kingdom and expressing that kingdom everywhere that we go. Let us read 1 Corinthians 13 again. Let us, as is written in the Old Testament, when the law was given, when the Israelites were told, write it, carry it on your arm, write it on your forehead, post it at your doorpost, at your door, as an indication that this is what it should be about. This is the way to live, with that in our hearts and in our minds. That great commandment of commitment to God's love and expressing that in the world. Let us be those people. Let us do what we've listened to in that beautiful ancient hymn. Amen.